Globalization. You hear that word thrown around all the time, and we tend to think of it as, a pretty modern thing. But the real story of our interconnected world, it's much, much older. Today, we're diving into the true historical making of our global world.
So let me just ask you, when do you think it all started? 50 years ago, maybe? With the internet and all the big multinational companies? Yeah, that's what most of us would probably guess.
But the thing is, the actual story goes back way further than that. The making of our global world isn't a story of decades. It's a story of centuries, a long, winding history of trade, of people moving, and of money flowing across borders. To really get a handle on this, we've got to go way, way back. For thousands of years, human societies have been linked in ways we don't always think about. We're talking travelers, traders, priests, pilgrims. They've always been on the move, carrying a whole lot more than just their personal belongings. And the perfect example of this ancient web has to be the Silk Routes. Now, this wasn't just one road. Think of it more like a sprawling network, crisscrossing over land and sea, literally knitting together huge parts of Asia and connecting them with Europe and North Africa. And this was happening long before the Christian era even began. And these routes, they were carrying so much more than just goods like Chinese silk or Indian spices. Ideas were traveling too. Buddhism spread out from India, and later on, Christianity and Islam took these very same paths. Money, like gold and silver, flowed from Europe into Asia. And yeah, something else traveled too. Something a lot less welcome: germs and disease. And you can actually see this exchange in our everyday lives. Take our food. It's thought that noodles traveled west from China and eventually became spaghetti. And so many of our common foods today, potatoes, tomatoes, corn, were totally unknown in places like Europe and Asia until about 500 years ago. Okay, so let's jump forward to the next major phase, starting around the 16th century. This is when the world really started to shrink in a way, after European sailors figured out sea routes to Asia and, most importantly, to the Americas. That accidental discovery of the Americas, it was an absolute game changer. All of a sudden, its huge lands, its different crops, its minerals, they all started to change life everywhere. Precious metals from places like Peru and Mexico basically bankrolled Europe's trade with Asia. But maybe even more important were the new crops. The humble potato, for instance, allowed Europe's poor to eat better and live longer, which in turn helps the population boom. But here's the thing. The European conquest of America wasn't just one with better firepower. No, the most powerful weapon they had wasn't a sword or a gun. It was biological: germs. The people of the Americas had been isolated for millions of years, so they had zero immunity to diseases from Europe like smallpox. And if you want proof, just listen to this chilling quote. The first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a man named John Winthrop, wrote this back in 1634. Smallpox didn't just kill individuals, it wiped out entire communities, which made conquest that much easier. And as you can see, some colonists even saw it as a sign from God, clearing their title to the land. All right, let's jump ahead again, this time to the 19th century. This was a period of incredible change. Economists usually point to three key movements, or flows, that really defined this era: the flow of trade, the flow of labor, which is just migration, and the flow of capital for big investments. And to see how all these flows were connected, just look at what happened in Britain. The government got rid of these things called the Corn Laws, and suddenly, cheap imported food started flooding in. British farms just couldn't compete. Thousands of farmers lost their jobs. So what did they do? They poured into the cities to find work, or they packed up and migrated overseas to places like America and Australia. And the scale of this was just mind-boggling. Across the entire world, it's estimated that about 150 million people left their homes during the 19th century, all looking for a better life. This was that massive flow of labor that literally reshaped the world map. Technology, of course, played a huge role in all of this. Take meat, for example. Before the 1870s, meat in Europe was a total luxury. Why? Because you had to ship live animals all the way from America, which was super expensive and inefficient. But then came refrigerated ships, and they changed everything. Now you could just ship frozen meat. Costs plummeted, and suddenly, meat became affordable for millions of ordinary people. So what was the result of all these changes? An absolute explosion in world trade. I mean, just look at this chart. Between 1820 and 1914, global trade multiplied by as much as 40 times. A truly global economy was born. But we have to be clear here. This new global economy had a much, much darker side. For huge parts of the world, getting more connected to the global economy actually meant losing their freedom and their livelihoods. This was the peak of colonialism, when European powers literally carved up continents, like Africa, for themselves. And a really tragic, awful example of this is a disease called rinderpest. It was a cattle plague brought to Africa by infected cattle from Asia. It spread like wildfire, killing up to 90% of the cattle in some places. This completely destroyed African livelihoods, which depended on that livestock, and it made it so much easier for European colonizers to take over and force people to work for wages. But this super interconnected world of the 19th century, with all its progress and its darkness, well, it wasn't going to last. The first half of the 20th century threw the world into a crisis so deep that it would take decades for it to recover. First, you had World War I, which just completely shattered the economic links between the world's biggest economies. Then, in 1929, the Great Depression hit, leading to a catastrophic collapse in just about everything: jobs, production, trade. And finally, World War II brought a level of destruction that the world had simply never seen before. But, out of all that wreckage, a new idea began to form. Economists and politicians looked back at the chaos of the last few decades and knew they had to build something better, something way more stable, so that this kind of catastrophe could never happen again. And they basically came away with two crucial lessons. First, if you have an economy built on mass production, you need mass consumption to keep it going, and for that, people need stable jobs and stable incomes. Second, they realized that markets, left to themselves, just can't guarantee that stability, so a new consensus emerged. Governments had to step in and help manage their economies. These lessons became the foundation for the famous Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. This is where the whole framework for the post-war global economy was hammered out. It created the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank to help keep things stable and help countries rebuild. It was really the beginning of a whole new era of global cooperation. So when you boil it all down, the main takeaway is this: globalization isn't just some buzzword from the 90s. It's the end result of a long, complicated, and often pretty brutal history. It's a story told through silk and potatoes, through steamships and diseases, all driven by this constant movement of people, money, and ideas. This incredible, centuries-long story is what built the world we're all living in right now. But that story isn't over. And that leaves us with one last question to chew on. What forces, whether they're technological, political, or environmental, are shaping the next chapter in the making of our global world?